Good evening. It seems that the chill of Canadian visits to the U.S. is having an impact on airlines. Air Transat announced today it is suspending the last of its U.S. flights for the summer season.
Rapidly deteriorating since President Donald Trump took office for his second term, tensions have shown no signs of slowing down as Canadian travelers have increasingly boycotted travel to the U.S.
Nobody saw this coming. Not the CEOs in Chicago, not the tourism boards in Miami, not even the lobbyists in Washington. But an escalating trade war, clashing border politics, and rising anti-U.S. sentiment in Canada have combined into something remarkable. A collapse of Canadian air travel to the United States so severe that entire airlines are cutting routes, dumping flights, and effectively rewriting the 2026 travel map. All with the tacit backing of voters frustrated by political grievances. What follows isn't a simple shift in vacation planning, it's a near economic boycott. A near collapse of one of the world's busiest travel corridors, and a story about how politics can suddenly reshape entire industries. By mid-2026, one airline stands at the center of this controversy: Air Transat. The Montreal-based carrier has announced that it will suspend all flights to the United States, including its most popular routes to Florida, for the summer 2026 season. Montreal to Orlando, Quebec City to Fort Lauderdale, and other Florida links will all disappear by June, completely halting U.S. service for the carrier. This is not a minor scheduling change. It effectively drops one of the oldest Canadian carriers out of the American market entirely for the first time in decades. Air Transat's decision is not happening in isolation. Rival carriers like WestJet and others have scaled back U.S. routes sharply, citing notable declines in demand from Canadian travelers. Routes to multiple cities, Tampa, Nashville, San Francisco, Atlanta, and more, have been suspended, signaling that transborder travel is no longer just softening, but structurally weakening. This is not a traditional airline market correction driven by fuel costs, strikes, or bad weather. This is a travel landscape being reshaped by geopolitics and consumer sentiment. The backdrop of these airline decisions is a weeks-long, unofficial, but rapidly snowballing movement among Canadian consumers and travelers who are actively choosing not to fly to the United States. Many Canadians cite rising tariffs, political rhetoric from the Trump administration, border policy frustrations, and even social and cultural tensions as reasons to avoid U.S. travel altogether. Polling data and airline analytics both tell the same story. Canadians are canceling U.S. travel plans in historic numbers, some even voluntarily forfeiting deposits, and booking alternatives in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Europe instead. Travel agencies report leisure bookings to U.S. cities down by as much as 40%. With 1 in 5 customers canceling U.S. trips outright over recent months. That shift has forced airlines to react. A route that used to be a backbone of Canada-U.S. connectivity, seasonal flights to Florida's beaches, is vanishing. The last Air Transat flights to Orlando International and Fort Lauderdale will be gone before summer's peak tourism season kicks off. For Florida tourism officials and U.S. travel companies that once counted on millions of Canadian visitors each year, this is a shock with a real dollar sign attached. But what makes this story controversial is not just that flights are disappearing, it's why they are disappearing. Official airline statements talk about declining demand and network optimization. That language alone would be routine, if not for a larger political current running through the entire trend. A broader Canadian boycott of U.S. travel spurred by months of economic and cultural friction. This isn't just about vacation preferences. According to government data and multiple industry reports, Canadians visiting the U.S. has dropped sharply. Cross-border airline capacity is down by more than 6% year over year, and seat availability down over 10%, reflecting a sustained departure from transborder travel rather than a temporary lull. Previous boycott patterns show similar drivers. In 2025, Canadians began actively rethinking not just what they buy, but where they travel, spearheaded by resistance to tariffs and political hostility perceived in U.S. policy. It culminated in a consumer movement that drastically reduced trips south of the border, with many travelers replacing American vacations with bookings to Mexico, the Caribbean, Europe, and beyond. Think about that for a second. Air travel decisions are now being shaped more by politics and national sentiment than by traditional travel economics. People are choosing their airlines and destinations based not on price or convenience, but on ideological reaction to cross-border government actions. This is borderline unprecedented in modern travel history, and it is hitting the U.S. where it hurts most. Tourism revenue, hotel occupancy figures, rental car businesses, theme parks, and hospitality industries reliant on Canadian visitors. Florida alone used to count on millions of Canadians yearly, visitors who spent hundreds of millions of dollars on hotels, food, entertainment, and local tourism infrastructure. Now, those visitors are disappearing from the equation. The backlash is not just symbolic. Tourism executives in the U.S. are publicly concerned. Hotel bookings are down. Theme parks see reduced Canadian attendance. Major hotel chains have reported softer domestic performance, with Canadian arrivals declining sharply. And while American tourism marketers try to reposition their messaging, the structural trend is clear. Canadian money that once fueled Sunbelt economies is being diverted elsewhere. And this is where the real controversy takes shape. The Trump administration has often used tough rhetoric and economic measures as tools of negotiation, from tariffs to border policy shifts. But in an unexpected twist, those very measures may be backfiring by triggering a grassroots movement that is eroding one of the most lucrative travel markets for the U.S. today. Imagine the headlines: travel agencies warning of a Canada flight exodus, airlines canceling routes to the United States entirely, and American tourism hubs seeing lower occupancy because Canadian wallets are now spending south of the border in Mexico instead. This isn't niche anymore. This is economic impact at scale. Airline executives are navigating uncharted waters. WestJet is redeploying its fleets to destinations Canadians do still want: Mexico, the Caribbean, even domestic summer spots, while phasing out less profitable U.S. flights. Other carriers are striking new deals with overseas carriers as long-haul travel increases and transborder routes contract. There are winners in this drama. Mexico's tourism industry, for instance, is experiencing a boom in Canadian arrivals as direct flights increase and destinations loosen entry requirements for Canadian visitors. Countries known for beach resorts like Los Cabos, Cancun, and Puerto Vallarta are benefiting from a flow of Canadian vacationers that might once have gone to Florida or California. But for the U.S., the emerging picture is troubling. A shrinking Canadian travel market isn't just a tourism statistic, it's a sign that geopolitical tensions can ripple into everyday consumer behavior with extraordinary force. And for regions heavily reliant on Canadian tourists, this shift is already costing jobs, revenue, and momentum. Whether Washington sees this as a warning sign or blames diplomatic tensions, for now, the effects are real. Flights are being cut, passengers are shifting their travel dollars, and an airline that once connected Canada and the United States through thousands of weekly routes is now pulling out entirely. For the U.S., this isn't just lost passengers, it's lost influence over one of its closest international travel markets. The fallout could shape tourism strategy for years and raise serious questions about the broader economic consequences of political polarization on cross-border travel. What began as a travel slowdown is now turning into something much bigger: a structural reset in one of the world's most stable cross-border relationships. For decades, Canada and the United States shared the busiest international travel corridor on the planet. Millions of Canadians flew south every year without thinking twice. Snowbirds filled Florida condos, families packed Orlando theme parks. Business travelers moved seamlessly between Toronto, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. It was routine, predictable, profitable. That predictability is gone. Air Transat suspending all U.S. flights is more than an airline adjustment. It signals that carriers no longer see short-term turbulence, they see sustained risk. Airlines do not abandon entire markets unless they believe demand will not recover quickly. Pulling Florida in summer 2026 means planners are looking far beyond headlines. They are forecasting sentiment, and sentiment has shifted. Canadian travelers are not simply reacting to one policy or one speech. They are responding to an accumulation of friction, tariffs, border rhetoric, trade disputes, enforcement imagery, and public political tension. Travel is emotional. Tourism thrives on comfort. Once travelers feel unwelcome or uncertain, recovery is slow. This is the part Washington may have underestimated. The Trump administration has often treated economic pressure as leverage: impose tariffs, demand concessions, renegotiate from strength. That strategy can work in trade disputes between governments. But when that same pressure spills into public perception, it stops being government to government and becomes consumer to market. Canadian travelers are voting with their wallets, and when millions of people shift behavior simultaneously, the numbers move fast. Florida has historically welcomed more Canadian visitors than any other U.S. state. In peak years, Canadians represented one of the largest international tourist groups, spending billions annually on hotels, rentals, restaurants, attractions, and retail. Entire seasonal economies were structured around predictable Canadian inflows. Now imagine that flow shrinking dramatically. Hotels lower occupancy forecasts, theme parks adjust staffing models, airlines redeploy aircraft to other markets, rental car fleets shrink, restaurant chains revise revenue projections. Each small adjustment compounds into larger economic pressure, and it doesn't stop in Florida. Cities like Las Vegas, Nashville, Phoenix, and Los Angeles have all depended heavily on Canadian air connectivity. Route cuts by WestJet and Air Transat ripple through airport revenues, concession businesses, airport staffing, and regional tourism boards. When an airline cancels a route, it's not just seats disappearing, it's infrastructure being deprioritized. Meanwhile, Canada is recalibrating. Instead of absorbing the travel decline as collateral damage, Canadian airlines are aggressively repositioning. WestJet and other carriers are adding capacity to Mexico, the Caribbean, and parts of Europe. Vacation packages are being marketed more heavily toward destinations outside the United States. Charter agreements are expanding. Partnerships with European carriers are strengthening. This is not emotional retaliation, it's strategic diversification. If demand to the U.S. weakens, airlines pivot to where demand remains strong. And right now, Canadians are choosing alternative destinations in record numbers. Mexico has become one of the biggest beneficiaries. Resort regions are seeing surges in Canadian arrivals. Direct routes have increased. Promotional campaigns are targeting former Florida travelers directly. The message is subtle but effective. Warm weather, lower friction, fewer political tensions. In business terms, Canada is redistributing outbound tourism capital. For the United States, this is uncomfortable territory. The U.S. travel industry has always assumed Canadian tourism as stable. It has never had to fight aggressively for it. Geography guaranteed proximity. Cultural similarity guaranteed familiarity. Shared language eliminated barriers. Now, political climate is outweighing geography. The most concerning aspect for U.S. officials is not the short-term drop, it's habit change. Travel habits, once broken, are difficult to rebuild. If a Canadian family that once vacationed in Orlando every winter now books Cancun 2 years in a row, that pattern becomes tradition. Children grow up expecting Mexico, not Florida. Loyalty shifts, emotional association resets. Airlines understand this deeply. That is why redeployment decisions are long-term strategic bets. And this is where the phrase "Trump faces disaster" becomes less dramatic and more economic. If Canadian outbound tourism permanently tilts away from the U.S., American regions that rely on predictable Canadian spending will have to compete harder, not just with price, but with perception. Tourism boards may need to invest more heavily in marketing campaigns specifically targeting Canadian audiences. Visa and entry messaging may need reassurance strategies. Airlines may have to subsidize routes to stimulate demand. Incentives may increase. All of this adds cost, and at the same time, domestic political rhetoric may continue sending mixed signals. The irony is sharp. While Washington pushes for economic leverage in trade disputes, a grassroots consumer shift may be undercutting tourism leverage in return. This is not a coordinated Canadian government sanction. There is no official boycott law. There is no embargo. This is consumer psychology operating at scale. And it may be more powerful than policy. There is also a geopolitical undertone. Canada is America's closest ally. The two countries share NORAD defense systems, integrated supply chains, energy grids, and the world's longest peaceful border. If even this relationship experiences tourism strain due to political tension, what message does that send globally? Other nations watch. If Canadians feel uneasy, what about European travelers, Asian tourists, Latin American visitors? The United States has long benefited from being perceived as welcoming, aspirational, and stable. When perception shifts, tourism responds faster than diplomacy. For now, Washington has not made travel a central talking point in this dispute. The focus remains on trade terms and economic positioning. But behind the scenes, tourism lobbyists are undoubtedly sounding alarms. Airlines cannot indefinitely operate under weak load factors. Airports cannot sustain long-term route reductions without impact. Hospitality industries cannot absorb declining foreign visitors without consequence. And 2026 is supposed to be a year of global attention, with major sporting events and international gatherings expected to drive tourism flows. Instead, the narrative forming is one of uncertainty. The broader risk for the U.S. is normalization of reduced Canadian travel. If 2025 and 2026 both show measurable declines, analysts may begin treating the drop not as a protest wave, but as a new baseline. That is when recovery becomes difficult. Because at that point, it is not about temporary anger. It is about altered patterns. Canada, meanwhile, appears prepared to adapt. Diversified tourism markets, strengthened airline partnerships, and increasing outbound flexibility reduce dependence on a single destination. The question now is not whether travel has declined. It has. The question is whether political tension will cool fast enough to restore confidence before new habits cement permanently. If not, the damage may not appear as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow, quiet erosion of one of the most profitable travel corridors in the world. And sometimes, erosion is more dangerous than collapse, because collapse forces repair. Erosion goes unnoticed until it's too late.